Mark 5:25 through 34. A large crowd followed and pressed around Jesus, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she had been freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be free from your suffering." I'll never forget the call from my mom at 5:30 that morning, telling me the news about my sister, my best friend, Kristen. I didn't answer the phone at first because it was so early, and I thought it was just an accident. But then she called again and left a voicemail. So I picked up my phone and I listened to it, and the first words out of my mom's mouth was that Kristen had been severely burned in a house fire. And so I didn't listen to the rest of the voicemail. I immediately called my mom back, and she told me that I needed to head to the hospital. So I quickly got up, got ready, emailed all of my professors, and went. And I remember sitting in the waiting room with all of our friends and family, just waiting for the nurse to come in to motion that I could go back and see her. And finally that time came, and I went, and I remember putting on the gloves and the apron to go back in the room. And whenever I got in there, she was hooked up to all the machines just like you see in the movies, and she couldn't talk because she had in a breathing tube, but she was fully aware and knew that I was there. And the only thing I could think to do in that moment was to pray with her. And me, a Bible major at the time, didn't even know what to say whenever we did pray. Over the course of those couple of days, I probably went through a whole box of gloves and aprons and things, just going back and visiting with her. And on that Wednesday, she had her first skin graft surgery, and it went really well. We got positive feedback the whole way through while we were sitting there waiting, and then she had her next surgery a couple of days after that. And so I came back to school. I'd already missed so much. I remember sitting here in Starbucks on campus, hanging out with my friends, and then I get a phone call from my other sister that Kristen had actually flatlined during surgery that day. And this was something that none of us expected to happen or were anticipating or worrying, since the first surgery had gone so well. And so I remember rushing to the hospital, and we found out that she had actually flatlined twice, because over the course of those days, the doctors didn't realize the internal damage that had happened. The smoke from the fire had actually caused her lungs to collapse. Our concerns for Kristen went from how her skin graft surgeries were going to look, to how was she going to get oxygen, how long was she going to have to stay in the hospital, and just thinking about how much support she was going to need from her friends and family. So over the course of those next 6 days, her oxygen levels would vary. They would be high, they would be low, and nothing was consistent. And the doctors were very concerned. They asked us if she had any other siblings or family or friends that wanted to spend time with her in her last few days, that they were anticipating her to be with us. And so whenever those words came out of the doctor's mouth, that was when the reality of losing Kristen really hit me. the doctors decided to try one more machine, one they had actually never used before in that unit. And so we were able to go home that night, knowing that she was still going to be with us tomorrow. And I had been there for hours on top of hours, so I decided to go get some rest. And the car ride home was one that I will never forget. Just thinking about the what ifs in losing her. What if she doesn't get to be in my wedding? Or what if I don't get to see her children be born? And the list could go on, and I just started crying to the point where I probably should have pulled over. But then I remembered back to scripture in the story of the woman reaching out in faith for healing. And I remembered the verse that says, "Daughter, your faith has healed you." So in that moment, I had a sense of encouragement and peace and joy that I had not had since the accident happened. I just thought and I prayed that if I have enough faith, that Kristen will be healed. So over the course of those next 2 weeks of just holding on to my faith and staying positive, I hadn't been that encouraged since the accident. I remember just receiving prayers and letters and cards from professors and other students on campus, and I truly thought that if I just had enough faith, if we all just continued to pray, having people praying all over the world for Kristen, that she was going to be healed. And at the end of those 2 weeks, the updates from the doctors just became too much, and I began to lose my faith. During this time, I could list 13 things that were wrong with Kristen. Her heart was failing, her kidneys were failing, her lungs were failing. She had a septic infection, and that's just to name a few of them. And at this moment, I remember just being angry and frustrated at God for the first time in my life. And I was no longer like the woman in the story, reaching out in faith for healing. My prayers were no longer faithful and encouraging. They were confusing and angry, and I just remember wanting and begging God for answers for why this was happening. And so I quickly found myself in another story in scripture, a story of a group of people out on a boat in the middle of a storm. And I wish I could say it was a relaxing, comforting yacht of sorts, but instead it was a small wooden boat being tossed by the waves of doctors back and forth. And I just remember being in the waiting room and just envisioning this story and looking at my friends and family and just all of us wanting some sort of encouragement or a smile, even from just each other. And then I remember just in the silence of my own mind just being like, Jesus, why are you letting us drown? Why are you having us go through this? And in that moment, I felt Jesus saying to me, as he did the disciples out in the boat, quiet and be still. And he says, do you still have no faith? Do you have little faith? And so in that moment, I just remember I'd been gripping on to the waiting room chair so much, and my grip began to loosen up, and my anxiety began to drift away as the doctors left the room. And in that moment, I realized that faith in God was never supposed to be easy. It was never meant to be trying to figure out what God is going to do, or trying to figure out who God is. Faith is trusting in something but lacking proof for it. Faith is when you come to that fork in the road where you can either choose to rebel against God and resentment for his ways that he's had with you, or you can choose to trust in him and have faith in the hope of who he says he is and that he is in control. I thought that whenever I prayed that prayer of faith, that Kristen would be healed, but I have to go back to what the book of Mark said. Mark doesn't say that our loved ones will never get hurt. Mark doesn't say that our parents won't get a divorce. And Mark doesn't promise that we'll get our dream job after college and live a perfect life. But he does say that Jesus will free us from our sufferings. Rather than being the disciples out in the middle of the sea questioning Jesus of where he is, we get to be the woman reaching out in faith and to remain confident and faithful that Jesus will let us go in peace and to be freed from our sufferings.